The year was 1893. The promise of a new life awaited Thomas Blackwood as the train thundered across the rugged terrain of Montana Territory. 4 weeks of travel had brought him from Philadelphia to this wild frontier, clutching nothing but a letter, a pocket watch, and the hope of marrying a woman he had never met. But the Montana he arrived at was not the one he had been promised. Instead of a young bride, he found an elderly woman. Instead of a welcoming home, he found a crumbling ranch. And instead of turning back east, Thomas made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. This is the story of a man who journeyed west to become a husband, but became something much more powerful instead. A champion for truth. In a land built on deception. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the prairie as the train pulled into the small settlement of Silver Creek. Thomas Blackwood peered through the dusty window, his gloved fingers nervously adjusting the collar of his fine wool coat. At 32, he had made the difficult decision to leave behind the familiar comforts of Philadelphia in exchange for the uncertainty of life on the frontier. The economic panic of 1893 had devastated his family's publishing business, leaving him with mounting debts and dwindling prospects back east. The advertisement placed by Eleanor Thornfield, promising a life of partnership on a prosperous cattle ranch, had offered him an escape from financial ruin. An arrangement that, while unconventional for a man of his standing, seemed his only path forward. Silver Creek Station, called the conductor, sliding open the door to Thomas's compartment. End of the line, sir. Thomas gathered his valise and stepped down from the train, his polished city shoes touching Montana soil for the first time. The settlement before him was hardly the bustling town Eleanor had described in her letters. A handful of wooden buildings lined a single dirt street, their weathered facades testifying to the harsh conditions of frontier life. A general store, a saloon, what appeared to be a rudimentary hotel, and a small church with a crooked steeple completed the humble tableau. Miss Thornfield was supposed to meet me here, Thomas said to the station master as he collected his 2 trunks. Eleanor Thornfield of Silvercrest Ranch. The station master paused, hat in hand, his weathered face creased with what appeared to be discomfort. Sir, I think you'd best speak with Sheriff Hayes. His office is right there. He pointed to a small building with a wooden star hanging from its porch. Thomas felt a twinge of apprehension. Is something wrong? Just speak with the sheriff, sir, the station master repeated, avoiding his eyes as he returned to his duties, leaving Thomas alone with his trunks in the middle of the dusty street. With his heart beginning to race, Thomas straightened his travel-worn suit, adjusted his hat, and made his way to the sheriff's office. The small bell above the door announced his arrival as he stepped inside. Sheriff Robert Hayes was a man in his 40s with a salt-and-pepper mustache and eyes that had seen their share of frontier justice. He was writing in a ledger when Thomas entered, but quickly stood when he saw him. You must be Mr. Blackwood, he said, his voice grave. I've been expecting you. Thomas felt the floor shift beneath him. How do you know my name? Where is Miss Thornfield? The sheriff gestured to a chair across from his desk. Please sit down, Mr. Blackwood. I'm afraid the situation is complicated. Thomas remained standing. Tell me what's happened. Sheriff. Hayes sighed deeply. Mr. Blackwood, Eleanor Thornfield isn't exactly who she claimed to be in those letters. What do you mean? Thomas demanded, his mind racing with possibilities. The woman who owns Silvercrest Ranch is indeed named Eleanor Thornfield, but the sheriff hesitated. She's 77 years old, sir. Thomas stared at him in disbelief. 77? There must be some mistake. The Eleanor I corresponded with described herself as 35, a capable rancher in need of a partner. I'm afraid there's no mistake, Hayes replied. The letters were indeed sent from Silvercrest, but I suspect they weren't entirely truthful about certain Details. Thomas sank into the chair, his mind reeling. This is preposterous. I sold everything. I owned to make this journey. My ticket was one way. I can't simply... The conversation was interrupted by the office door swinging open. Thomas turned to see an elderly woman enter, her back stooped with age, her face deeply lined beneath a wide-brimmed hat. She walked with the aid of a gnarled wooden cane, each step appearing painful and deliberate. "You must be Thomas," she said, her voice surprisingly strong despite her frail appearance. "I'm Eleanor Thornfield." Thomas rose slowly, shock and anger warring within him. "Madam, I believe there has been a grievous misrepresentation. The letters I received were from me," she interrupted, tapping her cane firmly on the wooden floor. And every word was true, after a fashion. Her eyes, bright blue and sharp, studied him with unsettling intensity. "You're taller than I expected. That's good. Strong back. You'll need it." "Mrs. Thornfield," Sheriff Hayes interjected, "Mr. Blackwood has traveled a great distance under certain assumptions." "And he'll get what was promised," she replied curtly. "A partnership in one of the finest ranches in the territory, assuming he's not too high and mighty to work for his keep." Thomas felt his face flush with indignation. "Madam, you deliberately deceived me. I came here expecting to meet a woman of suitable age for marriage, not someone who could be my grandmother." Eleanor's expression remained impassive. "Did I mention my age specifically in my letters, Mr. Blackwood? Or did you make assumptions based on what you wanted to believe?" Thomas opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. He tried to recall the exact wording of Eleanor's letters. She had described herself as experienced in ranch management, having run Silvercrest for years. She had mentioned looking for a partner with whom to share her remaining years. Had he simply interpreted these statements through the lens of his own expectations? "The stagecoach for Helena leaves tomorrow morning," Sheriff Hayes offered. "If you wish to return east, Mr. Blackwood, I'm sure arrangements could be made." Thomas hesitated. Return to what? His family's business was ruined, his reputation tarnished by debt. He had sold nearly everything he owned to make this journey. What remained of his funds would barely get him to Chicago, let alone establish him in a new venture. Eleanor seemed to sense his dilemma. "Before you decide, young man, I invite you to at least see Silvercrest Ranch. Judge for yourself whether what I offered is worth the disappointment of finding me somewhat older than you expected." Her tone carried a hint of challenge that struck a chord in Thomas. Despite his anger and sense of betrayal, curiosity stirred within him. What kind of woman would orchestrate such a deception? And what kind of ranch could justify such extraordinary measures to secure a partner? "Very well," he said finally. "I will see this ranch of yours before making any decisions." Eleanor nodded, seemingly satisfied. "My wagon is outside. We should start immediately if we're to reach Silvercrest before dark." As Thomas followed the elderly woman out to the street, where a simple wagon waited with a young ranch hand at the reins, Sheriff Hayes pulled him aside. "Watch yourself at Silvercrest, Mr. Blackwood," he murmured. "Things aren't always what they seem out there." Thomas nodded, grateful for the warning but unsure of its meaning. As he helped Eleanor into the wagon, with as much courtesy as he could muster given the circumstances, he wondered what other surprises awaited him at Silvercrest Ranch. The journey took them through rolling grasslands, dotted with sage and the occasional stand of cottonwood trees. Eleanor sat silently beside him, seemingly content to let him absorb the vastness of the Montana landscape. Despite his lingering anger, Thomas found himself impressed by the wild beauty surrounding them. The endless sky, the distant mountains tinged purple in the late afternoon light, the golden grasses swaying in the breeze. "Not what you're used to in Philadelphia, I imagine," Eleanor remarked, breaking the silence. "No," Thomas admitted. "It's more expansive than I anticipated." "Most Easterners feel small when they first see it," she observed. Some never get over that feeling. Others come to understand that the vastness isn't meant to diminish you, it's meant to let you expand into it. There was something in her words that gave Thomas pause. For all her deception, there seemed to be a wisdom in Eleanor Thornfield that couldn't be dismissed easily. As they crested a small rise, the ranch came into view. Thomas's breath caught in his throat. Silvercrest was nothing like the modest operation he had envisioned. A large two-story ranch house, built of sturdy logs and stone, dominated a well-organized collection of outbuildings. Vast pastures stretched in every direction, dotted with cattle. A clear stream cut through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods providing welcome shade. "Impressed?" Eleanor asked, a hint of pride in her voice. "It's substantial," Thomas conceded, unwilling to give her the satisfaction of his genuine amazement. Eleanor's eyes took on a distant look. "That's a long story, and one best told after you've had a chance to rest and refresh yourself. Suffice it to say that Silvercrest represents 40 years of my life, Mr. Blackwood. 40 years of struggle, sacrifice, and occasional triumph." As they approached the main house, several ranch hands appeared, nodding respectfully to Eleanor and eyeing Thomas with undisguised curiosity. "Jackson," Eleanor called to a middle-aged man who appeared to be the foreman. "This is Mr. Thomas Blackwood, from Philadelphia. He'll be staying with us for a time." The foreman's eyes narrowed slightly as he assessed Thomas. "Ma'am," he acknowledged with a nod, "we've prepared the east room as you requested." "Thank you," Eleanor replied. "Please see that Mr. Blackwood's trunks are taken up. He's had a long journey." As Thomas helped Eleanor down from the wagon, he noticed that despite her apparent frailty, her grip was surprisingly strong. There was much about this woman that didn't quite align with appearances. "You must have questions," she said, as they walked toward the house. "And I owe you some answers, but first let's get you settled." Thomas followed her into Silvercrest Ranch, his mind churning with confusion and suspicion. What game was this elderly woman playing, and why had she gone to such lengths to bring him specifically to Montana? Little did he know that the mystery of Eleanor Thornfield had only begun to unfold, and that the truth would prove stranger than anything he could possibly imagine. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The east room of Silvercrest Ranch was far more luxurious than Thomas had anticipated. Fine furniture that wouldn't have looked out of place in a Boston mansion filled the spacious bedroom. A four-poster bed with an intricately carved headboard dominated one wall, while a writing desk positioned beneath large windows offered views of the distant mountains. Bookshelves lined another wall, filled with volumes ranging from practical ranching manuals to classical literature. Thomas ran his fingers along the spines, surprised to find first editions of Thoreau, Emerson, and even Shakespeare among the collection. Not what you expected on a frontier ranch? He turned to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, her small figure somehow commanding the space despite her age. "I've found many things here not as I expected," Thomas replied, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Eleanor nodded, acknowledging his bitterness. "Dinner will be served in an hour. I imagine you'd like to refresh yourself after your journey." She gestured to a door in the corner. "There's a washroom through there. Hot water has been prepared." Before Thomas could respond, she turned to leave, then paused. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand your anger, but I hope you'll reserve judgment until you've heard the full story." Left alone, Thomas unpacked his few possessions, his mind churning with questions. The ranch's prosperity was undeniable, but why would its elderly owner need to deceive a man into coming west? And if she truly needed a partner, why not simply hire a manager or sell portions of her clearly valuable holdings? After washing away the dust of travel, Thomas changed into fresh clothes and made his way downstairs, following the aroma of cooking food. He found the dining room easily enough, a handsome space with a long table that could seat 12 comfortably. The table was set for only 3, however, with Eleanor already seated at the head. "Ah, Mr. Blackwood," she greeted him. "Please join us. Jackson will be dining with us this evening." The foreman entered from what Thomas presumed was the kitchen. Carrying a platter of roasted meat, he nodded curtly to Thomas before taking his seat. "We observe little formality at Silvercrest," Eleanor explained as she served herself from the dishes laid out. "Hard work builds appetites that don't wait on ceremony." The meal was surprisingly excellent. Roast beef, potatoes with herbs, fresh, bread and vegetables that must have come from the ranch's garden. Thomas ate with growing appreciation, realizing how hungry his journey had left him. "So, Mr. Blackwood," Jackson said, breaking the silence, "Mrs. Thornfield tells me you were in publishing back east." "I was," Thomas confirmed. "My family's business. For 3 generations, until the panic wiped us out." "And what do you know about ranching?" the foreman asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. "Very little," Thomas admitted, "though I'm a quick study." Jackson exchanged a glance with Eleanor that Thomas couldn't interpret. "Takes more than book learning to survive out here," the foreman remarked. "Yet survival seems to be the one thing I've excelled at recently," Thomas countered. "One adapts or perishes." Eleanor's eyes crinkled slightly at his response. "Well said, Mr. Blackwood." She turned to Jackson. "How are the preparations for the cattle drive coming along?" The conversation shifted to ranch business, and Thomas listened attentively, gathering that Silvercrest was preparing to move a substantial herd to market in Helena within the week. The logistics were complex, the planning meticulous, and he found himself impressed by the efficiency with which Eleanor managed the operation, despite her age. After dinner, Eleanor invited Thomas to join her in the study, another room that defied frontier expectations with its leather chairs, oak desk, and walls of books. A large map of the territory hung behind the desk, with Silvercrest's boundaries marked. "In red. Brandy?" she offered, pouring herself a small glass without waiting for his response. Thomas accepted, surprised again. "You're full of contradictions, Mrs. Thornfield." "Age affords one the luxury of inconsistency," she replied, settling into a chair and gesturing for him to do the same. "Now, I imagine you have questions." "More than can be answered in one evening," Thomas said, sipping the excellent brandy. "But let's start with the obvious. Why the deception? Why not simply advertise for a ranch manager?" Eleanor studied him over the rim of her glass. "Would you have come if I had? A 77-year-old woman seeking a business partner." "Perhaps not," Thomas admitted, "but that hardly justifies—" "And there's your answer," she interrupted. "I needed someone specific, someone educated, resourceful, with nothing left, to lose back east. Someone desperate enough to start over, yet principled enough to be trustworthy." "You make me sound like a rare specimen," Thomas remarked dryly. "Rarer than you might think." Eleanor set down her glass and leaned forward. "Silvercrest isn't just a ranch, Mr. Blackwood. It's my life's work, yes, but it's also something more. Something that requires protection. Protection from what?" Her expression darkened. "Have you heard of Victor Caldwell?" Thomas shook his head. "Mr. Caldwell owns the Double C Ranch bordering our land to the north. He's what passes for nobility in these parts, wealthy, connected, influential with territorial officials. He's also determined to acquire Silvercrest by any means necessary." "Why not sell to him if you need a successor?" Thomas asked. Eleanor's laugh held no humor. "Because Victor Caldwell represents everything I've spent my life fighting against. He sees the land as something to be conquered, exploited, drained of resources, until nothing remains but dust and broken promises." She gestured to the window. "I've built Silvercrest on different principles: sustainability, respect for the land, fair treatment of workers. If Caldwell takes over, all that ends." Thomas considered this. "And you believe I can help prevent that because—" Because you have nothing to do with the existing power structures here, no ties to Caldwell or his allies, and because your background gives you skills we desperately need. She reached for a leather folder on the side table and handed it to him. Take a look. Inside, Thomas found correspondence between Eleanor and various territorial officials, records of water rights disputes, and troubling reports of intimidation against smaller ranchers in the region. He quickly grasped that Caldwell's expansion wasn't merely ambitious, it was potentially illegal. You need someone who can navigate legal challenges, Thomas said, understanding dawning. Someone who can document what's happening and present it effectively to authorities who might otherwise dismiss an elderly woman's complaints. Eleanor nodded. Precisely. Jackson is an excellent foreman, but his talents lie in running the ranch, not in dealing with lawyers and politicians. Thomas closed the folder, his mind racing. This explains why you need help, but not why you specifically sought a husband. Eleanor's eyes met his directly. Because, Mr. Blackwood, Caldwell knows I'm elderly and alone. He's waiting for me to die so he can swoop in and buy Silvercrest from whatever distant relatives might inherit it. But if I were to have a legal heir, a husband with rights to the property, his plans would be considerably complicated. So you want me to marry you to secure the ranch's future? Thomas asked incredulously. In name only, of course, Eleanor clarified. You would gain a home, financial security, and eventually inheritance of one of the finest ranches in Montana. I would gain protection for Silvercrest's legacy. Thomas stood and paced the room, trying to process this extraordinary proposal. Mrs. Thornfield, while I appreciate your directness, this is highly unusual. I came expecting a conventional marriage, not to be a pawn in a territorial land dispute. Eleanor watched him calmly. Mr. Blackwood, nothing about the frontier is conventional. We adapt to survive, as you so eloquently put it earlier. She rose with some difficulty. I don't expect an answer tonight. Take time to consider my offer. Tour the ranch tomorrow. Speak with the hands. Understand what's at stake. She moved toward the door, but paused with her hand on the knob. One more thing, Mr. Blackwood. While your resentment at my deception is understandable, don't let it blind you to the opportunity before you. Few men get second chances as promising as this one. With that, she left him alone with his thoughts and the remnants of excellent brandy. Thomas moved to the window, gazing out at the vast Montana night. Stars speckled the sky with a clarity he'd never seen in Philadelphia, their light casting silver shadows across the land. In the distance, he could make out the silhouettes of the ranch buildings, and beyond them, the endless rolling prairie. Eleanor Thornfield was either a manipulative schemer or a principled visionary, perhaps both. The prospect she offered was simultaneously preposterous and compelling. Marriage to a woman more than twice his age in exchange for eventual ownership of a ranch worth a fortune? It sounded like madness. Yet as he contemplated the alternative, returning east to face creditors and humiliation, Thomas found himself surprisingly reluctant to dismiss the proposal outright. There was something about Silvercrest, about the vastness of the land and the clarity of purpose it seemed to inspire, that called to something deep within him. A soft knock at the study door interrupted his reflections. He turned to find a young woman standing there, perhaps in her mid-20s, with copper hair pulled back in a practical braid and eyes that regarded him with undisguised curiosity. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice carrying just a hint of a southern accent. "I hope I'm not disturbing you. I'm Dr. Rebecca Sullivan, the ranch physician. Mrs. Thornfield asked me to check on you, ensure your journey didn't leave you with any health concerns." Thomas blinked in surprise. "A female doctor on a cattle ranch?" The young woman's expression hardened slightly. "Yes, Mr. Blackwood, a female doctor on a cattle ranch. Is that going to be a problem? And just like that, Silvercrest Ranch revealed yet another of its mysteries. I assure you, Dr. Sullivan, I have no objection to female physicians, Thomas said, recovering from his initial surprise. I'm merely unaccustomed to finding one in such a remote location. Rebecca Sullivan's expression softened slightly. Fair enough. Silvercrest tends to challenge everyone's expectations. She set her medical bag on a nearby table. Mind if I check your pulse? The altitude affects some Easterners rather severely. Thomas extended his arm, watching as she professionally assessed his condition. Her hands were steady and confident, her manner brisk but not unkind. Mrs. Thornfield mentioned you arrived today, she commented. Quite a shock, I imagine. Which part? Thomas asked wryly. Finding my prospective bride is 77, or being offered marriage as a business arrangement? Both, I suppose. A hint of amusement crossed her face. Though neither is the strangest thing you'll encounter at Silvercrest if you stay. Are you speaking as the ranch physician or as Mrs. Thornfield's confidant? Rebecca released his wrist. Neither. I'm speaking as someone who also arrived here expecting one thing and found something entirely different. She closed her bag. Your pulse is steady, but you should drink plenty of water for the next few days. The dry air dehydrates faster than you'll notice. Before Thomas could inquire further about her cryptic comment, Jackson appeared at the door. Doc, you're needed at the north pasture. One of the hands took a fall from his horse. Rebecca nodded. I'll get my supplies. She turned back to Thomas. Rest well, Mr. Blackwood. Tomorrow will likely test your Eastern sensibilities in ways you can't imagine. After they departed, Thomas returned to his room, his mind churning with the day's revelations. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by strange dreams of vast prairies and shadowy figures watching from distant ridges. Dawn broke with a clarity that startled him awake. The eastern light streamed through windows he'd forgotten to cover, painting the room in hues of gold and amber. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, Thomas couldn't remember where he was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back. The elderly Eleanor, the magnificent ranch, the bizarre marriage proposal. He dressed quickly, in the most practical clothes he'd brought, which he realized with some chagrin were still woefully inappropriate for ranch life. As he made his way downstairs, the house was already alive with activity. Ranch hands moved purposefully through the kitchen, grabbing coffee and biscuits before heading out to their duties. Jackson stood at the center of this controlled chaos, issuing instructions and answering questions with the easy authority of a man accustomed to command. He acknowledged Thomas with a nod. Mrs. Thornfield asked me to show you the operation today, the foreman said. Hope you can ride. I've had some experience, Thomas replied, not mentioning that his experience consisted mainly of leisurely outings in Philadelphia parks. Jackson's skeptical expression suggested he hadn't been fooled. We'll start you on Maple. She's steady enough for beginners. An hour later, Thomas found himself mounted on a docile chestnut mare, following Jackson across the rolling grasslands of Silvercrest. The morning was cool, the sky an impossible blue that seemed to stretch forever. Despite his soreness and the foreman's occasionally condescending instructions, Thomas found himself captivated by the landscape. Mrs. Thornfield started with just 40 acres, Jackson explained as they crested a rise overlooking a verdant valley. Built this piece by piece over 4 decades. How did she manage it? Thomas asked. A woman alone in frontier territory couldn't have had an easy time claiming land. Jackson's expression grew guarded. That's her story to tell. All I'll say is she's smarter and tougher than most men I've known. They continued their tour, Jackson pointing out boundary lines, water sources and grazing areas. As they rode, Thomas noticed several crews of ranch hands engaged in various tasks, mending fences, moving cattle, repairing outbuildings. What struck him most was the diversity among them. Unlike the Eastern businesses he was familiar with, Silvercrest employed not just white men, but also several black and Mexican workers, and even 2 women riding alongside the men, dressed in practical trousers and performing the same work. "Mrs. Thornfield has unusual hiring practices," Thomas observed. "She hires people who can do the job," Jackson replied simply. "Doesn't much care about the rest." As they approached a northern boundary marked by a swift-flowing creek, Jackson reined in his horse. "That's Caldwell land beyond the water," he said, his voice hardening. "Double C Ranch." Thomas studied the terrain. The land across the creek looked no different than Silvercrest, the same rolling hills, the same rich grass, yet Jackson viewed it with unmistakable hostility. "What exactly has Caldwell done to earn such enmity?" Thomas asked. Jackson was silent for a moment, then pointed to a stand of cottonwoods downstream. "See where that creek bends? 3 years ago, Caldwell diverted the water flow, trying to force the smaller ranches on the other side to sell out when their pastures dried up. Would have worked too if Mrs. Thornfield hadn't caught wind of it and threatened to take him to the territorial courts. And that's legal grounds to stop him?" "Not exactly," Jackson admitted. "But Mrs. Thornfield had documentation going back 20 years, showing the natural flow of the creek and prior water rights agreements. Caldwell backed down that time, but he's been looking for other ways to expand ever since." The foreman's expression grew somber. "2 months ago, one of our hands was found dead near this boundary. Official ruling was an accident, thrown from his horse. But his mare was the steadiest in our stable, and he'd been riding these lands for 15 years without incident." "You believe Caldwell was responsible?" Thomas asked, connecting this new information with Eleanor's concerns. "Can't prove anything," Jackson said carefully, "but Marsh was the one who caught Caldwell's men tampering with the creek, and he wasn't the first unfortunate accident along this boundary." As if summoned by their conversation, 3 riders appeared. On the opposite bank, they approached slowly, with the casual confidence of men on their own territory. The lead rider was a man in his 60s, expensively dressed despite his Western attire, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard. His pale eyes assessed Thomas with calculating precision. "Jackson," he called across the water, "introducing new blood to Silvercrest's operations. Eleanor must be getting desperate." "Mr. Caldwell," Jackson acknowledged stiffly. "Just showing our new partner the boundaries, making sure everyone understands where Silvercrest land begins and ends." Caldwell's gaze shifted fully to Thomas, his expression a mixture of curiosity and dismissal. "And you are?" "Thomas Blackwood, recently of Philadelphia," Thomas replied, maintaining a neutral tone despite the immediate dislike he felt for the man. "Ah, another Easterner," Caldwell remarked with a thin smile. "Eleanor does favor importing her allies from afar. I don't suppose she mentioned that Silvercrest would be better served as part of a larger operation. Economies of scale, Mr. Blackwood. Surely a businessman understands that concept." Before Thomas could respond, Caldwell continued, "When you tire of playing cowboy, and you will, come see me. I'm always in the market for educated men who understand progress." With that, he turned his horse and rode away, his men following close behind. "Charming neighbor," Thomas remarked dryly once they were out of earshot. Jackson snorted. "That's Victor Caldwell being polite. You haven't seen him when he's actually trying to intimidate someone." They continued their tour, circling back toward the main ranch buildings by midday. As they approached, Thomas noticed unusual activity. Wagons being loaded, supplies inventoried, and ranch hands checking gear with methodical precision. "Preparations for the cattle drive?" Thomas asked. Jackson nodded. "Moving 600 head to Helena day after tomorrow, biggest drive of the season." As they dismounted near the stables, Thomas spotted Rebecca Sullivan organizing medical supplies by one of the wagons. Seeing his interest, Jackson explained, "Doc always rides with us, Trail accidents happen, and she's the best sawbones in 3 territories. Thomas handed Maple's reins to a stable hand, surprised at how reluctant he felt to part with the gentle horse. Despite his aching muscles and the unfamiliar terrain, he had enjoyed the morning's ride more than he expected. "Mr. Blackwood," a voice called from the direction of the house. Eleanor Thornfield stood on the porch, looking remarkably sprightly for her age. "I trust Jackson has shown you the extent of our operation?" "He has," Thomas confirmed, climbing the porch steps to join her. "It's even more impressive than it appeared yesterday." "And did you encounter any neighbors during your ride?" Eleanor asked, her shrewd eyes studying his reaction. "We had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Caldwell," Thomas replied, noting how her expression tightened at the name. "He seemed quite interested in my presence here." Eleanor sighed. "I expected as much. Caldwell misses very little that happens in this valley." She gestured toward the door. "Come inside. I believe it's time I answered more of your questions." As Thomas followed her into the house, he realized something had shifted within him during the morning's ride. The anger and sense of betrayal that had dominated his thoughts upon arrival had been replaced by genuine curiosity, not just about Eleanor's unusual proposal, but about Silvercrest itself. There was clearly more happening at this Montana ranch than a simple territorial dispute, much more, as the afternoon would reveal. Eleanor led Thomas to a part of the house he hadn't seen before, a small study at the back of the residence with windows overlooking a well-tended garden. Unlike the grand main study with its imposing desk and leather chairs, this room felt intimate, personal. Watercolor landscapes hung on the walls, a rocking chair sat beside a stone fireplace, and bookshelves held not business ledgers, but volumes of poetry and novels. "My private sanctuary," Eleanor explained, settling into the rocking chair with a soft groan. "The only place on Silvercrest where I'm just Eleanor, not Mrs. Thornfield, the ranch owner." Thomas took the offered seat across from her, noting the contrast between this softer space and the formidable woman who had orchestrated his journey west. "You promised answers," he reminded her gently. Eleanor nodded, her gaze drifting to the window. "I did." She was silent for a moment, then asked unexpectedly, "What do you see when you look at me, Mr. Blackwood?" The question caught him off guard. "I see an elderly woman who has built something remarkable in an unforgiving land. And before that, when you first stepped off that train?" Thomas hesitated, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "I saw deception," he admitted. "A woman who had misrepresented herself to lure me across the country." Eleanor's laugh was surprisingly musical. "Accurate, if incomplete." She turned back to him, her blue eyes sharp with intelligence. "Age is both a shield and a prison, Mr. Blackwood. People underestimate you, dismiss you, speak freely around you, yet simultaneously limit what they believe you capable of." She leaned forward slightly. "I need you to understand something fundamental about Silvercrest before we continue. This ranch isn't merely property. It's a vision, a demonstration that the West can be settled without the exploitation and violence that has characterized so much of the frontier's development." "Admirable," Thomas acknowledged, "but that doesn't explain the elaborate ruse to bring me here." "Patience, Mr. Blackwood. Context matters." Eleanor rose slowly and moved to a small secretary desk in the corner. From a drawer, she retrieved a leather-bound journal and handed it to him. "This belonged to my husband, Edward Thornfield. He began Silvercrest in 1853, when this was still wilderness." Thomas opened the journal carefully. The handwriting was precise, the entries detailing the challenges and triumphs of establishing a ranch in untamed territory. Edward Thornfield had been a thoughtful man, his observations extending beyond practical matters to reflections on the ethical responsibilities of land ownership and the treatment of indigenous peoples. "He sounds like a remarkable individual," Thomas commented. "He was," Eleanor agreed, a distant smile playing on her lips. "Edward believed the frontier offered an opportunity to build something better than what we'd left behind, a society founded on fairness and mutual respect rather than exploitation. When he died in '68, I continued his work." Thomas did the mental calculation. "You've run Silvercrest alone for 25 years? "Not entirely alone," Eleanor clarified. "I've had good people helping me. Jackson, Dr. Sullivan, others who share our vision. But yes, the responsibility has been mine." She returned to her seat, her expression growing more serious. "Now we face a threat that cannot be overcome with hard work alone. Victor Caldwell represents everything Edward and I fought against. The belief that might makes right, that resources exist solely for the taking, that progress is measured only in dollars and not in the well-being of the land and its people. "And you believe I can help counter this threat?" Thomas asked, still uncertain of his role in her plans. "I do." Eleanor's gaze was steady. "But I haven't been entirely forthcoming about why." Thomas felt a renewed surge of wariness. More deceptions. "Mrs. Thornfield, necessary ones." She rose again, this time moving to a small cabinet. From it, she withdrew a framed photograph and handed it to Thomas. The sepia image showed a young couple standing before a half-built log structure, presumably the original Silvercrest homestead. The man was tall and lean, with an intelligent face and thoughtful eyes that matched the voice Thomas had encountered in the journal, but it was the woman beside him that caused Thomas's breath to catch. Though decades younger, the features were unmistakable. The same determined chin, the same intelligent eyes. But there was something else, something in the bone structure and the set of the shoulders that seemed hauntingly familiar from his own reflection. "This was taken in 1854, Eleanor said quietly. "That's Edward. And me." Thomas looked up sharply. "Impossible. You would be well over 100 years old." "I'm 96, actually," Eleanor replied calmly, as if discussing nothing more remarkable than the weather. "I've aged well, all things considered." Thomas stared at her, searching for signs of senility or deception, and finding neither. Her eyes remained clear, her manner composed. "Mrs. Thornfield, what you're suggesting is difficult to believe, I know." She reclaimed the photograph, studying it with a wistful expression. "The truth is often more fantastical than any lie. I might have invented." She returned to her seat. "Have you heard of the fountain spring?" Thomas shook his head, still struggling to process her claim. "Few have. The Blackfoot people considered it sacred, a place where the veil between worlds is thin. Edward and I discovered it during our second year here, high in the mountains on what is now Silvercrest's eastern boundary." Eleanor's voice took on a rhythmic quality, as if reciting an often-told story. "The water was clear as crystal, cold as winter. Edward drank first, then I. We thought nothing of it, just grateful for fresh water after a long day's ride." She smiled at the memory. "Within a week we noticed changes. Small injuries healed overnight, chronic ailments disappeared, and as the years passed, we realized we were aging differently, more slowly than others." "You're claiming this spring has extended your life?" Thomas asked incredulously. "Not indefinitely," Eleanor clarified. "I'm still aging, just at perhaps a third of the normal rate. Edward lived to 94 before his heart finally gave out. A remarkable age for a man born in 1818. Thomas rose and paced the small room, trying to make sense of her story. If such a spring existed, surely others would know of it. It would be famous throughout the territory, throughout the world. "Which is precisely why we kept it secret," Eleanor replied firmly. "Can you imagine what would happen if its existence became common knowledge? The land would be stripped bare by treasure seekers, indigenous sacred sites destroyed, the natural balance of this entire region disrupted by human greed." Her logic, at least, was sound, even if her claims strained credulity. Thomas found himself in the disorienting position of wanting to dismiss her story as the ramblings of an elderly woman, while simultaneously confronted with the clear evidence of her lucidity and the inexplicable photograph. "Where is this spring now?" he asked finally. "Gone," Eleanor said, a shadow crossing her face, "or rather, hidden. After Edward died, I realized how dangerous the knowledge had become. I diverted the underground source, concealed the location, removed all references to it from our maps and documents. But Caldwell knows something," Thomas guessed, connecting pieces of the puzzle. Eleanor nodded grimly. "He found references to it in old territorial surveys. He doesn't know exactly what he's looking for, but he's convinced Silvercrest hides something valuable, minerals perhaps, or oil. His attempts to acquire my land have grown increasingly aggressive as his own health has begun to fail." She fixed Thomas with an intent gaze. "Which brings me to you, and why I needed to bring you here under unusual circumstances." "I'm listening," Thomas said, finding himself drawn into her narrative despite his skepticism. "Your mother's maiden name was Catherine Thornfield, was it not?" Thomas stared at her in shock. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because Catherine was Edward's niece," Eleanor said gently, "which makes you, Thomas Blackwood, Edward's great-nephew and my last living relation, distant though it may be." The room seemed to tilt around Thomas as he absorbed this revelation. "You're claiming we're related. That's why you brought me here." "Family was important to Edward," Eleanor explained. "When I began looking for someone to entrust with Silvercrest's future, I researched his bloodline. Most branches had died out, but the Blackwood connection survived through Catherine." She reached across and took his hand, her paper-thin skin cool against his. "I didn't just need a business partner or a legal shield against Caldwell, Thomas. I needed someone with Thornfield blood, someone who might understand what we built here and why it matters." Thomas withdrew his hand, his mind racing. "Even if what you say about our connection is true, and I'm not conceding that it is, what about the rest? This fantastic tale of a magical spring, am I supposed to simply accept that?" "I don't expect immediate belief," Eleanor said reasonably. "Only an open mind while you consider the evidence before you." She gestured around the room. "Stay at Silvercrest. Join the cattle drive tomorrow. Get to know the people and the land. Make your own judgments." She rose with the aid of her cane. "The choice will remain yours, Thomas. You can return east whenever you wish, but I think you'll find, as I did all those decades ago, that Silvercrest has a way of claiming those who belong to it." As she moved toward the door, she paused. "One last thing. The marriage proposal stands, though I understand it seems even more peculiar now. It's the simplest legal method to ensure you inherit Silvercrest when I'm gone, which, despite my unusual longevity, will indeed happen eventually." Left alone in the small study, Thomas turned back to the photograph, studying the young Eleanor's. A face with new awareness. The resemblance to his mother's family was subtle, but undeniable. The same set of the eyes, the same high cheekbones that he himself had inherited. Could it possibly be true? Or was he being manipulated by an elaborate confidence scheme, the details of which he couldn't yet fathom? As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, Thomas Blackwood found himself in the disorienting position of questioning not just Eleanor Thornfield's extraordinary claims, but the very nature of reality as he had understood it. Dawn arrived, with a flurry of activity as Silvercrest prepared for the cattle drive. Thomas had spent a restless night, his mind churning with Eleanor's revelations. Part of him wanted to dismiss her claims as the elaborate fantasy of an eccentric old woman, yet the evidence, the photograph, the family resemblance, her uncanny knowledge of his mother's maiden name, nagged at his skepticism. He dressed, in clothes that had been left outside his door, Sturdy denim trousers, a flannel shirt, and a canvas jacket better suited to ranch work than his Eastern attire. They fit surprisingly well, as if measured precisely for his frame. The main yard hummed with purposeful chaos. Cowboys checked cinches and loaded supplies, chuck wagons stood ready for departure, and the distant lowing of cattle gathered in the way. Holding pens created a constant backdrop of sound. Jackson moved through it all, a calm center directing the storm of preparation. "Didn't expect to see you up so early," the foreman remarked when he spotted Thomas. "Mrs. Thornfield said you might want to ride along for the first day, see what a real cattle drive looks like." "I'd like that," Thomas replied, surprising himself with his eagerness. Despite his confusion about Eleanor's claims, something about the energy of the ranch pulled at him. Jackson studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Maple's already saddled for you. Stay close to Doc Sullivan, she'll keep you out of trouble." As if summoned by her name, Rebecca appeared, leading her own horse, a sleek black gelding that pranced impatiently. She wore practical riding clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, with saddlebags Thomas assumed contained medical supplies. "So you're joining us, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her expression neutral, but her eyes assessing him with professional intensity. "Just for the day," Thomas clarified. "I understand it's a 5-day journey to Helena?" "If the weather holds and nothing goes wrong," she confirmed, which, in my experience, is rarely the case. Before Thomas could respond, a commotion at the edge of the yard drew their attention. Eleanor Thornfield had emerged from the house, but she looked remarkably different from the frail, elderly woman who had greeted him upon his arrival. Gone was the stooped posture and shuffling gait. Though still clearly advanced in years, she moved with surprising vigor, spine straight and steps firm. She wore riding clothes and a weathered hat that had seen many seasons, and most startling of all, she carried no cane. The transformation wasn't complete. Her face still bore the deep lines of age, her hair remained silver white, but the change was dramatic enough that Thomas found himself staring. "Close your mouth, Mr. Blackwood," Rebecca murmured beside him, amusement coloring her voice. The facade was necessary in town, where people have certain expectations about how an elderly woman should behave. Here on Silvercrest, she has less need for pretense. "You knew," Thomas said, turning to her, "about her age, about everything." "Some of it," Rebecca admitted. "Mrs. Thornfield keeps her own counsel. But yes, I'm aware she's exceptional." Eleanor approached them, acknowledging the respectful nods from the ranch hands as she passed. "Good morning, Thomas," she greeted him, her voice stronger than he remembered. "I see you found the clothes." "Thank you," he replied, still disconcerted by her transformation. "They're much more suitable than what I brought." "Edward's measurements," she explained with a hint of nostalgia. "You have his build." She turned to Jackson. "Are we ready to move out?" "Just about, Ma'am. Weather looks good. Scout reports no trouble along the eastern route." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. "Then let's begin." Thomas helped Rebecca mount her horse, then climbed somewhat awkwardly onto Maple. "Is Mrs. Thornfield joining the drive?" he asked, surprised. "For the first few miles," Rebecca explained. "It's tradition. She rides out with the herd, then returns to the ranch. In her younger days, she made the full journey to Helena and back." The cattle drive began with a coordinated precision that impressed Thomas. Ranch hands positioned themselves around the herd of 600 cattle, guiding them out of the holding pens and onto the trail that would take them to market. The animals moved reluctantly at first, then with growing momentum as the leaders found the path. Eleanor rode at the front, flanked by Jackson and 2 experienced hands. Thomas and Rebecca followed at a distance, along with the chuck wagon and supply horses. Behind them stretched the living, moving river of cattle, a sight unlike anything Thomas had experienced in his eastern life. "It's magnificent," he said, unable to contain his awe at the scale of the operation and the sweeping beauty of the landscape. The rising sun cast long shadows across the grassland, and the mountains loomed blue and majestic in the distance. "It is," Rebecca agreed, a smile softening her features. "No matter how many drives I've ridden, that first morning never loses its magic." They rode in companionable silence for a time, Thomas gradually adjusting to Maple's steady rhythm. The initial chaos of the departure settled into a methodical pace, the hands calling occasional instructions to each other or whooping to redirect straying cattle. "How did you come to Silvercrest?" Thomas asked eventually, curious about the unusual. "A female doctor. It seems an unlikely place for someone with your training." Rebecca's expression grew distant. "I graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in '89, found that a medical degree didn't overcome the reluctance to hire a female physician. After a year of rejection letters, I answered an advertisement for a doctor needed on a Montana ranch. Mrs. Thornfield specifically sought a woman doctor. She specifically sought the best qualified doctor, regardless of gender," Rebecca corrected. "When I arrived, I assumed it was a mistake, that they'd expected a male Dr. Sullivan. But Eleanor just smiled and said, 'Your references were impeccable. The gender of the hands that set a broken bone is irrelevant.'" Thomas nodded, recognizing the practical wisdom that seemed to characterize Eleanor's approach to running Silvercrest. "And you've been here ever since?" 4 years now, Rebecca confirmed. "He serves Silvercrest and the surrounding homesteads. It's not the prestigious Philadelphia hospital position I once dreamed of, but the work is meaningful. People need me here." As they talked, Thomas noticed a rider approaching from the direction of the ranch, a young hand moving at a gallop. He reached Eleanor and Jackson, spoke urgently for a moment, then all three turned their horses and began riding back toward Thomas and Rebecca. "Something's wrong," Rebecca said, instantly alert. Eleanor pulled up alongside them, her expression grim. "Thomas, we need to return to the ranch. A telegram arrived from Silver Creek just after we left. Sheriff Hayes was trying to reach us." "What's happened?" Thomas asked, alarmed by her tone. "Victor Caldwell has filed a legal challenge to your presence at Silvercrest," she explained tersely. "He's claiming you're an imposter with no legitimate connection to the Thornfield family." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. How could he possibly know about my arrival, let alone my supposed connection to your family? "He has informants everywhere," Jackson growled, "and this is too convenient to be coincidence." Eleanor's sharp eyes studied Thomas. "It seems our neighbor has taken a particular interest in you, which suggests he knows more than he should. We need to respond to these allegations immediately." They turned back toward the ranch, leaving Rebecca to continue with the cattle drive. As they rode, Eleanor explained the situation in greater detail. "Caldwell has petitioned the territorial court, claiming I'm mentally incompetent and being manipulated by an unscrupulous Easterner, you, who's attempting to defraud me of my property." "That's absurd," Thomas protested. "I only arrived yesterday," which makes his swift legal action all the more suspicious, Eleanor agreed. "He's been watching, waiting for an opportunity. Your arrival somehow triggered this response." Back at the ranch, they found Sheriff Hayes waiting on the porch, his expression troubled. He greeted them with a nod, his eyes widening slightly at Eleanor's more vigorous appearance. "Mrs. Thornfield, Mr. Blackwood," he acknowledged. "I'm afraid I'm here on official business. The territorial judge has requested your presence in Silver Creek tomorrow morning regarding Mr. Caldwell's petition." Eleanor dismounted with surprising agility for her age. "Robert, this is harassment, pure and simple. Caldwell is attempting to interfere with my business operations during our most critical cattle drive of the season." "I don't disagree," the sheriff admitted, "but Judge Wilson has taken a particular interest in this case. He's concerned about the sudden appearance of a previously unknown Thornfield relation." His gaze shifted to Thomas. Mr. Blackwood, Caldwell's attorneys have been quite thorough. They've already sent telegrams to Philadelphia questioning your background and the circumstances of your arrival here. Thomas felt a surge of anxiety. While he hadn't misrepresented himself, Eleanor's claims about their family connection remained unproven. If Caldwell's investigators dug deeply enough, they might discover the unusual correspondence that had brought him west. Correspondence that could indeed appear suspicious when examined by hostile eyes. "Do you have documentation of your relationship to the Thornfield family?" Hayes asked directly. "I only learned of the connection yesterday," Thomas admitted. "My mother never spoke much about her family." The sheriff's expression suggested this answer did little to help their case. "The judge will expect more substantial evidence." Eleanor led them inside to her study, closing the door firmly behind them. "This is a deliberate attack," she said once they were private. "Caldwell is testing our position, looking for weaknesses." "Why now?" Thomas asked. "What's changed that would prompt such immediate action?" Eleanor and Jackson exchanged a loaded glance. "The drought," Jackson said finally. 3 months without significant rainfall has dropped water levels throughout the territory. Springs that have flowed consistently for decades are drying up. Thomas connected the implications immediately. The fountain spring. Exactly, Eleanor. "Confirmed. If it exists, and Caldwell clearly believes it does, lower water tables might reveal its location or make it more accessible. So my arrival represents a threat to his search," Thomas reasoned. "A new player on the board when he thought you were vulnerable and alone. And he's responding with the weapons he wields best. Legal challenges, character assassination, and public scrutiny," Eleanor said grimly. "If he can discredit you and raise questions about my competence, he positions himself as the concerned neighbor stepping in to prevent exploitation." Sheriff Hayes cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mrs. Thornfield, I should warn you that Judge Wilson has always been sympathetic to Caldwell's interests. I'm not saying the court is corrupted, but we should prepare for an unfavorable ruling," Eleanor finished for him. She turned to Thomas, her eyes sharp with determination. "The question is, Mr. Blackwood, are you prepared to defend our family connection before a hostile judge, knowing that doing so aligns you against the most powerful man in the territory?" Thomas found himself at a crossroads. He could walk away from this increasingly complicated situation, perhaps accept Caldwell's inevitable offer of employment, and extricate himself from Eleanor Thornfield's extraordinary claims. The rational choice, certainly, yet something held him back, not just the tantalizing possibility that Eleanor's wild tale might be true, but a growing sense of indignation at Caldwell's heavy-handed tactics and what they represented. The same forces of unchecked power and exploitation that had ruined his family's business in Philadelphia were at work here on the frontier, merely wearing different clothes. "I'll defend it," he said firmly, surprising himself with his conviction. "Whether or not I'm convinced of our connection, I won't be intimidated by Caldwell's legal manipulations." Something like pride flickered across Eleanor's weathered face. "Then we have preparation to do, nephew. By tomorrow morning you need to become a Thornfield in more than just distant blood." As Sheriff Hayes departed with promises to do what he could to ensure fair treatment, Thomas found himself wondering what exactly he had committed to, and why the prospect of standing beside Eleanor against Victor Caldwell felt so inexplicably right. The territorial courthouse in Silver Creek was a modest building that nonetheless managed to project authority through its formal Greek Revival facade, an architectural anomaly in the frontier town. Thomas adjusted his borrowed suit, grateful that Eleanor had preserved some of Edward's more formal attire. The jacket's shoulders were slightly too broad, but the overall effect was presentable enough for a frontier courtroom. "Remember," Eleanor murmured as they climbed the courthouse steps, Judge Wilson was appointed through Caldwell's political connections. Don't expect impartiality. Thomas nodded, noticing how Eleanor had reverted to her more frail persona for this public appearance. Shoulders slightly stooped, steps measured and careful, leaning on her cane with apparent dependence. The transformation was remarkable, and he wondered how many other layers of deception surrounded this enigmatic woman. The courtroom was already crowded when they entered. Victor Caldwell sat at the plaintiff's table, flanked by two well-dressed men Thomas assumed were attorneys. The rancher's eyes followed them as they made their way to the defense table, his expression a mixture of calculation and smug confidence. Quite the audience for a simple competency hearing, Thomas observed, noting the packed gallery. Many faces he recognized from his brief time in Silver Creek, but there were others, well-dressed individuals who seemed out of place in the frontier setting. Caldwell's allies, Eleanor explained quietly. Businessmen from Helena, territorial officials, investors in his operations. He's making a show of force. Their own attorney, Martin Webb, met them at the defense table. He was younger than Thomas, expected perhaps in his early 30s, with intelligent eyes and a serious demeanor. Mrs. Thornfield, he greeted Eleanor with respectful familiarity. Mr. Blackwood, we have a challenging morning ahead. He lowered his voice. Caldwell's attorneys have submitted affidavits from Philadelphia questioning your business failure and subsequent departure. They're building a narrative of financial desperation. Thomas felt a surge of anger. How could they possibly gather such information so quickly? Telegram lines to the East Coast work remarkably efficiently when backed by Caldwell money, Webb replied dryly. Before they could discuss further, a side door opened and Judge Wilson entered. A corpulent man in his 60s with thinning grey hair and the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed his spirits. The court bailiff called for all to rise, and the proceedings began. The opening statements established the battle lines clearly. Caldwell's lead attorney, a sharp-featured man named Harrington, painted a picture of a vulnerable elderly woman being taken advantage of by an unscrupulous Easterner with a dubious background and convenient claims of family connection. We will demonstrate, Harrington concluded with practiced gravity, that no legitimate Thornfield relation exists, that Mr. Blackwood arrived under suspicious circumstances following a business failure in Philadelphia, and that he has already begun positioning himself to take control of Silvercrest Ranch, one of the territory's most valuable properties. When Martin Webb rose for the defense, his youth seemed to fall away, replaced by confident authority. Your Honor, this proceeding is nothing more than a transparent attempt by Mr. Caldwell to interfere with a legitimate family matter. Mrs. Thornfield, whose mental acuity remains undiminished at 77, has welcomed her great-nephew to Silvercrest. Mr. Blackwood's presence threatens no one except perhaps those who have designs on Thornfield property. Judge Wilson's expression remained impassive, but Thomas noted how his gaze drifted to Caldwell several times during Webb's statement, as if seeking cues. The testimony began with Caldwell himself, who spoke with the practiced ease of a man accustomed to deference. I've known Eleanor Thornfield for over 20 years, he testified smoothly. She's always been a formidable woman, but age takes its toll on even the strongest minds. In recent months, I've observed concerning changes, confusion about property boundaries, forgetfulness during business discussions, uncharacteristic decisions regarding ranch operations. And what prompted your legal action at this specific time? Harrington asked. Caldwell's expression shifted to one of grave concern. When I learned that a stranger from the East had suddenly appeared, claiming to be family never before mentioned in all our years of acquaintance, I feared Mrs. Thornfield was being manipulated. My petition seeks only to protect her interests, until proper investigation can confirm or refute Mr. Blackwood's claims. The performance was masterful, Thomas had to admit. Caldwell projected sincere concern rather than the naked ambition Thomas had glimpsed during their encounter at the creek. Sheriff Hayes testified next, reluctantly confirming that Thomas had arrived just 2 days prior and that Eleanor had never previously mentioned a great-nephew from Philadelphia. Under cross-examination by Webb, however, he acknowledged that Eleanor Thornfield had always been private about family matters and that she showed no signs of mental deterioration. "Mrs. Thornfield runs that ranch with the same sharp mind she's always had," Hayes stated firmly. "I've seen no evidence of confusion or vulnerability to suggestion. The most damaging testimony came from Harold Simmons, Silver Creek's telegrapher, who produced copies of telegrams exchanged between Eleanor and Thomas prior to his arrival. In these communications, Harrington emphasized, there is no mention of family relationship whatsoever. Instead, we see arrangements for what appears to be a potential marriage between Mrs. Thornfield and Mr. Blackwood, a woman of 77 and a man of 32. A murmur ran through the courtroom, and Thomas felt a sinking sensation. The telegrams, stripped of context, indeed painted a picture that could seem inappropriate or suspicious. When Eleanor took the stand, she had perfected her performance as a dignified elderly woman. Clear-minded but showing her age, she acknowledged the telegrams but reframed their content with remarkable skill. "My late husband Edward always valued family above all," she testified, her voice strong despite her fragile appearance. "When I discovered through family correspondence that Catherine Thornfield had married into the Blackwood family and produced a son, I naturally wished to connect with Edward's blood relation." "And why present the possibility of marriage in your communications?" Webb asked. Eleanor's smile combined mischief and dignity. "A test, Mr. Webb. I wish to assess Thomas's character before revealing our family connection. Would he be interested in Silvercrest solely for potential financial gain, or would he show integrity even when faced with an unusual proposition?" It was a brilliant pivot, turning the questionable telegrams into evidence of Eleanor's sound judgment, rather than vulnerability. When Thomas finally took the stand, he felt the weight of the courtroom's scrutiny. Harrington's cross-examination was relentless, picking apart his business failure in Philadelphia, questioning his knowledge of ranching, and repeatedly highlighting the convenient timing of his discovery of Thornfield relations. "Mr. Blackwood," Harrington pressed, "can you provide any documentation whatsoever proving your mother's maiden name was Thornfield or establishing any connection to Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield's family?" "My mother's personal papers were lost in the financial difficulties that claimed our family business," Thomas replied honestly. "However—" "A convenient absence of evidence," Harrington interrupted. "However," Thomas continued firmly, "I have something that may be more compelling than paper records." With Webb's permission, Thomas approached Eleanor and stood beside her, turning to face the gallery. "I invite the court to observe the family resemblance," he said clearly, "particularly around the eyes and the structure of the cheekbones, Thornfield traits that have passed down through generations." A murmur went through the courtroom as people leaned forward, studying the two faces. Despite the age difference, the similarity in certain features was indeed noticeable, not definitive proof, perhaps, but enough to plant doubt in Caldwell's narrative. "Furthermore," Thomas continued, returning to the witness stand, "Mrs. Thornfield has detailed knowledge of my mother's childhood that could only have come from family connections, stories and particulars never published or known outside the family circle." As the testimony concluded, Judge Wilson called a brief recess before ruling. Thomas, Eleanor, and Webb conferred quietly at the defense table. "You handled yourself well," Webb acknowledged, "but Caldwell has stacked the deck. Without documentary evidence of your relationship, the judge has latitude to rule however he wishes." Eleanor seemed remarkably calm. "There's one piece of evidence we haven't presented," she said softly. "Something I've held in reserve. Before she could elaborate, the judge returned and the courtroom fell silent. "This case presents unusual circumstances," Wilson began, his tone measured. "On one hand, we have serious concerns raised by a respected member of the community regarding potential exploitation of an elderly property owner. On the other, we have Mrs. Thornfield's clear testimony that she is of sound mind and recognizes Mr. Blackwood as family." He cleared his throat importantly. "In the absence of definitive documentation, and given the significant property interests at stake, I am inclined to proceed with caution. Therefore, I hereby order—" "Your Honor," a new voice interrupted from the back of the courtroom. "The court's indulgence, please." All heads turned to see a tall, distinguished man in his 60s making his way down the center aisle. His immaculate three-piece suit and authoritative bearing immediately commanded attention. "I am Justice James Montgomery of the Supreme Court of Montana Territory," he announced, approaching the bench and presenting documents to the startled Judge Wilson. "I have been asked by the territorial governor to take special interest in this case, given certain concerns about potential conflicts of interest." The color drained from Judge Wilson's face as he reviewed the papers. Victor Caldwell half rose from his seat, his expression thunderous. "Justice Montgomery," Wilson stammered, "this is most irregular. I was not informed." "Intentionally so," Montgomery replied crisply. "The governor has received troubling reports about the administration of justice in Silver Creek, particularly in matters involving certain prominent citizens." His gaze swept meaningfully toward Caldwell before returning to Wilson. "I will be assuming jurisdiction of this case effective immediately. This court is adjourned until tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, at which time I will preside." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs as Justice Montgomery turned and walked back down the aisle. Thomas stared at Eleanor, whose expression revealed nothing, though a slight smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Did you know this would happen?" he whispered as they gathered their things. "Let's just say I still have a few connections in Helena," she replied enigmatically. "The governor's wife was a dear friend in younger days." As they exited the courthouse, Thomas noticed Caldwell engaged in heated conversation with his attorneys. On the steps, the rancher broke off mid-sentence when he saw them, his face hardening into a mask of barely contained fury. "This changes nothing, Eleanor," he called out, loud enough for the dispersing crowd to hear. "Justice Montgomery can't manufacture evidence that doesn't exist. Your Eastern nephew is still an imposter." Eleanor paused, leaning heavily on her cane for the public performance. "Victor," she replied, her voice carrying clearly despite its apparent frailty, "after all these years, you still underestimate me. That has always been your greatest weakness." As they continued toward the hotel where they would spend the night, Thomas felt a growing appreciation for Eleanor Thornfield's strategic mind. She had anticipated Caldwell's legal maneuver and countered with one of her own, demonstrating a level of political influence that belied her seemingly isolated position. "The battle isn't won," she cautioned as they walked. "Montgomery is fair, but he'll still require evidence. Tomorrow will be crucial." "What did you mean about evidence?" "Held in reserve," Thomas asked. Eleanor glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. Edward kept detailed genealogical records, including correspondence with his sister when she moved east. Those records mention Catherine's birth and early years. I've never shown them to anyone outside the family." "That could establish the connection," Thomas acknowledged. "But why not present them today?" "Because they're not in Silver Creek," Eleanor replied. "They're hidden at Silvercrest, in a place only family would know to look." As the implications of her statement sank in, Thomas realized that Eleanor had created a test within a test, a way to verify not just his claimed identity, but his trustworthiness and commitment to Silvercrest itself. The question was whether he was prepared to fully embrace the role she had designed for him, knowing that doing so would irrevocably align him against Victor Caldwell and all he represented. Darkness had fallen by the time Thomas and Eleanor left Silver Creek, traveling in a closed carriage with Jackson at the reins. Eleanor had insisted on departing immediately despite the late hour. "Caldwell won't take today's setback lightly," she explained as the carriage rattled along the rutted road. "He'll be planning his next move, and I'd rather be on Silvercrest land when he makes it." Thomas studied her in the dim lamplight of the carriage interior. Away from public eyes, she had abandoned the exaggerated frailty of her courthouse performance, sitting straight-backed and alert despite the jolting journey. "You never intended to stay for tomorrow's hearing," he realized. Justice Montgomery's appearance was a diversion. Eleanor's smile held a hint of mischief. "James is an old friend who owed me a favor. His intervention bought us time, nothing more. The real battle won't be won in a courtroom." "Where will it be won?" "On Silvercrest land," she replied, her expression growing serious. "Caldwell knows I've hidden something valuable. Until now, he's been patient, using legal channels and subtle pressure. But Justice Montgomery's appearance has forced his hand. He'll move more directly now." Thomas absorbed this, connecting pieces of the complex game Eleanor had been playing. "You're using me as bait," he said, the realization dawning. "My arrival provoked Caldwell into action, revealing his hand prematurely." "Not bait," Eleanor corrected firmly. "A catalyst, perhaps. Your presence has accelerated events that were already in motion." She reached across to touch his arm briefly. "But I wouldn't have brought you here if I didn't believe you belonged at Silvercrest, Thomas." The carriage hit a particularly deep rut, bouncing its occupants. Jackson called down from the driver's seat, "Rider approaching from the west." Eleanor tensed, reaching beneath her seat to withdraw a shotgun that Thomas hadn't realized was there. She handed it to him without comment, then produced a revolver for herself. "Stay inside," Jackson instructed, slowing the horses. Thomas peered through the carriage window, trying to make out the approaching rider in the moonlight. The figure drew closer, and he recognized the silhouette of a woman on horseback. "It's Dr. Sullivan," he said with relief. Rebecca pulled alongside the carriage, her expression urgent. "Thank goodness I found you. There's trouble at Silvercrest." Jackson reined the horses to a stop as Eleanor opened the carriage door. "What's happened?" "Caldwell's men," Rebecca explained breathlessly. "At least 6 of them armed. They appeared at the ranch about an hour ago, claiming they were looking for evidence of water rights violations. They're searching the property." Eleanor's face hardened. "Were any of our people hurt?" "No, but only because I ordered everyone to stand down. They outnumbered us, and most of our hands are still with the cattle drive." Thomas felt a surge of admiration for the young doctor. She'd clearly taken charge of a dangerous situation with level-headed pragmatism. "They're focused on the East Ridge," Rebecca continued. "Near the old mine entrance." Eleanor and Jackson exchanged a meaningful glance. "That's too close," Eleanor said quietly. "We need to get back now." "The main road will be watched," Jackson warned. "Then we'll take the canyon trail," Eleanor decided. She turned to Thomas. "It's a difficult path, not suitable for the carriage. Can you ride?" "I'll manage," he assured her, though his experiences on Maple had hardly prepared him for a nighttime ride on treacherous trails. Within minutes, they had abandoned the carriage, concealing it among trees off the main road. Jackson unhitched the horses, and soon they were mounted, Thomas somewhat unsteadily, and following the foreman along a narrow path that wound into rugged terrain east of the main ranch. "The canyon trail follows an old game path," Eleanor explained, as they rode single file through increasingly rough country. "Few people know of its existence. It will bring us to Silvercrest, behind the main house, away from where Caldwell's men are searching." Thomas concentrated on staying mounted as his horse navigated the difficult terrain. The moonlight cast everything in silver and shadow, making it difficult to judge distances and drops. Ahead, Rebecca and Jackson moved with the easy confidence of experienced riders familiar with the path. "Eleanor," he called softly, drawing his horse alongside hers during a slightly wider stretch of trail. "What exactly are we racing to protect? Is it truly just the spring?" She was silent for a moment, her face pensive in the moonlight. "The spring is part of it," she admitted, "but there's more at stake. Edward discovered something unexpected when he first found the spring, something that would be dangerous in the wrong hands." Before she could elaborate, Jackson halted ahead, raising a hand for silence. They froze, listening. The faint sound of voices carried through the night air. "They've expanded their search area," Jackson whispered as they gathered close. "We'll need to swing further east, approach through the high meadow." The detour added nearly an hour to their journey, but eventually they crested a rise that offered a view of Silvercrest below. Lantern light moved near the outbuildings where Caldwell's men continued their search. The main house stood dark and seemingly unattended. "We'll approach from behind the barn," Jackson decided. "There's enough cover to get us to the house undetected." They dismounted, leaving the horses secured in a small grove, and proceeded on foot. Thomas followed Eleanor's lead, impressed by her sure-footed navigation of the rough terrain despite her age. Whatever the spring had done for her, it had preserved a physical vitality that defied her years. Staying low and using the shadows for cover, they made their way across Silvercrest land toward the main house. Once, they froze as a lantern-bearing searcher passed within 30 yards, but the man moved on without detecting them. At the back door of the house, Rebecca produced a key. "I locked up before leaving," she whispered. "As far as I know, they haven't searched inside yet." The interior was dark and silent. Jackson moved through the rooms with practiced stealth, confirming they were alone before returning to where Eleanor waited in the kitchen. "Clear," he reported, "but they'll eventually make their way here." Eleanor nodded. "Then we have little time." She turned to Thomas. "Now we determine whether you truly belong at Silvercrest, Mr. Blackwood." "What do you mean?" "The documents that could prove your connection to this family are hidden where only a Thornfield would think to look." Her gaze was intense in the dim light, filtering through the windows. "If you are who I believe you are, who I hope you are, you should be able to find them." Thomas stared at her in disbelief. "How could I possibly know where to look in a house I've barely seen?" "Because Edward designed this place," Eleanor explained patiently, "and the Thornfields have always had particular ways of safeguarding what matters most. Your mother would have learned these principles from her Thornfield relatives, even if she never spoke of them directly to you." The request seemed impossible, yet Thomas found himself considering the problem. What would a family known for ranching and frontier survival consider secure? Where would they hide their most precious documents? "Think, Thomas," Eleanor urged. "In your childhood home, where did your mother keep important papers? Not where they were most hidden, but where they would be safest from the elements, from fire or flood." A memory surfaced. His mother insisting that certain family documents be kept in a copper box beneath the hearthstones. When Thomas had asked why, she had simply said, "Stone doesn't burn, and metal protects from damp. It's the Thornfield way." "The fireplace," he said suddenly. "Something beneath or within the stone hearth?" Eleanor's smile was radiant with approval. "Which one, Thomas? The house has 3. Without hesitation, he answered, "The main study. It would be where the family conducted its business, made its decisions. The heart of the house." "Show me," Eleanor requested simply. Thomas led the way to the grand study where he had first discussed Eleanor's proposal. The stone fireplace dominated. One wall, its hearth made of massive granite slabs. He knelt before it, running his hands over the cool stone, searching for irregularities. "The cornerstone," he murmured, almost to himself. It would be the cornerstone. His fingers found a slight depression in the right-hand cornerstone. Pressing it produced no result, but when he simultaneously pushed against the left cornerstone, he felt a subtle shift. The center hearthstone moved slightly, revealing it could be lifted. With effort, Thomas raised the heavy stone slab, revealing a hollow beneath. Inside lay a copper box, identical in design to the one his mother had kept. The Thornfield family crest, Eleanor observed, as Thomas lifted the box and examined the embossed design on its lid. "Do you recognize it?" He did. The same pattern had adorned his mother's box, though he had never known its significance. "A stag beneath an oak," he confirmed, with 3 stars above. Inside the box lay a collection of documents, yellowed letters, legal papers, and a leather-bound family Bible with a carefully maintained family tree. Thomas's fingers traced the entries, finding Edward Thornfield's name, then his sister, Margaret's, followed by her daughter Catherine, Thomas's mother. "This proves it," he said quietly, the weight of the revelation settling over him. "We are related." "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "You are a Thornfield by blood, if not by name, the last of Edward's line." The moment of discovery was interrupted by Jackson's urgent whisper from the doorway. "They're approaching the house." Through the window, they could see lanterns moving across the yard toward the main entrance. Caldwell's men had evidently decided to expand their search to include the house itself. "We need to leave now," Jackson insisted. "Take the documents and go." Thomas carefully returned everything to the copper box, but hesitated at one item, a small leather pouch that had lain beneath the papers. Something about it called to him, and without fully understanding why, he slipped it into his pocket before replacing the hearthstone. They retreated toward the kitchen, just as the sound of the front door being forced open echoed through the house. Eleanor led them to a pantry at the rear of the kitchen, where she quickly moved aside several preserved food jars to reveal a small door built into the wall. "The root cellar," she explained in a whisper. "The tunnel beyond leads to the spring. House by the creek. We can exit there unseen." The narrow passage forced them to move in single file, hunched over to avoid the low ceiling. The earthen tunnel, braced with timber supports at intervals, sloped gently downward for perhaps 50 yards, before opening into a small stone structure built partially into the creek bank. Once outside, they paused to catch their breath. The spring house concealed their location from the main buildings, but they could see lantern light moving within the house they had just vacated. "What now?" Thomas asked, clutching the copper box that contained proof of his heritage. "Now we retrieve." "What Edward found," Eleanor said, her expression resolute. "The real reason Caldwell wants Silvercrest land." She led them along the creek for several hundred yards, then up a steep, brush-covered slope that concealed their movement from the valley below. At the top, a massive outcropping of rock created a natural landmark visible from much of the property. "Eagle." "Rock," Jackson explained as they approached. "Natural boundary marker for the eastern property line." Eleanor moved to a particular spot at the base of the formation where smaller rocks had accumulated in what appeared to be a natural rockfall. She began moving stones aside with surprising strength, revealing a narrow opening. "The entrance to the old mine," she explained, "officially played out and abandoned in 1867, according to territorial records, but not actually abandoned," Thomas guessed. "Edward sealed it himself," Eleanor confirmed, "after what we found inside." She withdrew a small lantern from beneath a stone shelf and lit it, then gestured for Thomas to follow her into the narrow passage. Jackson and Rebecca remained outside, standing guard. The tunnel angled sharply downward, cut through solid rock by miners' tools decades earlier. After about 30 yards, it opened into a larger chamber where the original mining operation had extracted whatever ore they had been seeking. Eleanor raised her lantern, illuminating the space. "This is what Edward discovered when he followed. A water seep from the spring, she said quietly. This is what changed everything. At first, Thomas saw nothing unusual, just an abandoned mine chamber with the remnants of old equipment. Then, as his eyes adjusted to the lantern light, he noticed unusual formations along one wall, crystalline structures unlike anything he had seen before, glowing with a faint luminescence that seemed to come from within the rock itself. "What is it?" he asked, approaching the wall cautiously. "We never determined its exact nature," Eleanor replied. Edward had scientific training, but this was beyond his understanding. He called it living stone, a mineral formation that responds to water, to touch, even to human presence. As if to demonstrate, she placed her palm against one of the larger formations. The glow intensified slightly beneath her hand, and Thomas could have sworn he felt a subtle vibration in the air around them. "The spring that preserved our youth flows through this chamber," Eleanor explained. "The water absorbs something from these formations before emerging on the surface. That's what gives it its unique properties." Thomas remembered the small leather pouch he had taken from the copper box. Acting on instinct, he withdrew it and carefully opened the drawstring. Inside lay a small fragment of the same luminescent crystal. Edward's sample, Eleanor confirmed, seeing it in his palm. He carried it with him for years, studying it, trying to understand its properties. When he died, I sealed it away with the family documents. "And Caldwell knows about this?" Thomas asked, struggling to comprehend the implications. "He knows something of value exists beneath Silvercrest," Eleanor replied. "Rumors of the glowing rocks have circulated for decades among old miners. Recently, his geologists have been testing water samples from the creek, finding traces of unusual minerals. He's getting closer." Thomas carefully returned the crystal fragment to its pouch. What would happen if he found this chamber? Eleanor's expression darkened. "Edward and I agreed long ago that these formations must remain undisturbed. We don't understand their nature, but we recognized their power. In Caldwell's hands, they would become a resource to be exploited, regardless of consequences." A faint sound from the tunnel entrance caught their attention, a subtle displacement of stones that didn't match the natural settling of the mountain. "Someone's coming," Thomas whispered, extinguishing the lantern. In the sudden darkness, the crystal wall glowed more visibly, bathing the chamber in an eerie blue-green light. Eleanor gripped Thomas's arm, pulling him toward a narrow fissure in the rear wall. "There's another way out," she whispered, "but we must hurry." As they squeezed through the opening, Thomas heard voices echoing in the main chamber behind them. Caldwell's men had found the mine entrance. The hunt was on, and the stakes were far higher than a simple ranch inheritance. The narrow fissure led them through a winding passage that gradually sloped upward. Thomas clutched the copper box containing his family records in one hand while following Eleanor through the darkness, guided only by the faint glow emanating from the crystal fragment in his pocket. The sounds of pursuit faded behind them, but urgency still propelled them forward. "This passage follows a natural seam in the mountain," Eleanor whispered. "Edward mapped it years ago as an emergency exit." The tunnel eventually opened onto a small ledge high on the eastern slope of the mountain, concealed by juniper bushes and offering a commanding view of Silvercrest below. In the moonlight, Thomas could see lanterns moving near the mine entrance as Caldwell's men continued their search. "They won't find this exit," Eleanor assured him, catching her breath. "The opening is too well hidden from the inside. Jackson and Rebecca were nowhere to be seen." Thomas hoped they had retreated to safety when Caldwell's men approached. "We need to reach Justice Montgomery," he said, assessing their situation. "With these family records and your testimony, we can establish my legitimate claim and counter Caldwell's accusations." Eleanor's expression was grave in the moonlight. "Legal victory won't stop him, Thomas. Now that his men have seen the crystal chamber, he'll never cease pursuing it." "Then what do we do?" Before she could answer, a flash of movement below caught their attention. A rider was approaching the mine entrance at a gallop, a distinctive figure Thomas recognized even at a distance. "That's Caldwell himself," he murmured. Eleanor nodded grimly. "Summoned by his men, no doubt. They wouldn't disturb him at this hour unless they'd found something significant." They watched as Caldwell dismounted and disappeared into the mine entrance, surrounded by his men. Minutes passed in tense silence, until suddenly the ground beneath them trembled slightly. "What was that?" Thomas asked, alarmed. Another tremor followed, stronger this time, and a muffled sound echoed from the mine entrance below. Even from their distance, they could see dust billowing from the opening. "The crystals are unstable when disturbed," Eleanor explained, her voice tight with concern. Edward discovered that certain vibrations, even loud sounds, could trigger reactions within the formations. As if confirming her words, a larger tremor shook the mountainside. Rocks began sliding down the slope near the mine entrance, and shouts of alarm rose from Caldwell's men as they emerged, dragging something or someone with them. "The mine is collapsing," Thomas realized, with Caldwell inside. Without hesitation, he started down the slope, but Eleanor caught his arm. "Thomas, no, it's too dangerous." "We can't leave him to die," he insisted, pulling free. "Whatever his crimes, that's not justice." He scrambled down the steep path, half sliding through loose scree as the tremors intensified. Behind him, Eleanor called his name, but he pressed on, driven by an instinctive certainty that allowing Caldwell to die in the collapse would forever taint Silvercrest's legacy. Reaching the lower slopes, Thomas encountered panicked men fleeing the area, too concerned with their own safety to question his presence. The mine entrance was partially blocked by fallen rock, and dust filled the air, making it difficult to breathe. Two men struggled to drag an unconscious Caldwell from the narrowing opening. Thomas rushed to help them, gripping the rancher's shoulders and pulling with all his strength. Together they extracted him, just as another tremor sent more rocks crashing down, sealing the entrance completely. "Get clear of the slope," Thomas shouted to the men. "The whole area is unstable." They needed no encouragement, abandoning Caldwell to Thomas's care as they fled. Thomas checked the rancher's pulse, still strong, though a gash on his forehead bled freely. He hoisted the unconscious man over his shoulder in a firefighter's carry and staggered towards safer ground as the mountainside continued to shudder. By the time he reached level terrain near the creek, the tremors had subsided. Thomas laid Caldwell on the grass and tore a strip from his shirt to bind the wound. As he worked, he became aware of approaching hoofbeats, Rebecca and Jackson arriving with horses, Eleanor riding double with the doctor. "Is he alive?" Eleanor asked as she dismounted with Rebecca's assistance. "Yes," Thomas confirmed. "Unconscious but stable." She knelt beside her longtime adversary, studying his face with an unreadable expression. "You risked your life for him." "I couldn't let him die," Thomas said simply. "Not like that." Eleanor's gaze lifted to his, something like pride warming her eyes. "Edward would have done the same. It's the Thornfield way. Protecting the land doesn't mean abandoning humanity." Groan from Caldwell interrupted their exchange. The rancher's eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to recognition as he saw Eleanor and Thomas kneeling over him. "The mine," he rasped. "The crystals are sealed away," Eleanor finished for him, "perhaps permanently." Caldwell struggled to sit up, wincing with pain. "You've known about them all along, all these years." "Yes," she acknowledged, "and chose to protect them rather than exploit them." She gestured toward Thomas. "Just as my great-nephew chose to save your life rather than let the mountain claim you." Confusion crossed Caldwell's face as he looked at Thomas. "Great-nephew, you thought wrong," Thomas interrupted, producing the copper box. "I am a Thornfield by blood, with the documentation to prove it. Your legal challenge was built on false assumptions." Caldwell slumped back, defeat etching lines in his dust-covered face. "It doesn't matter anymore. What I saw in that chamber, it changes everything." "What did you see?" Rebecca asked sharply. The rancher's eyes held a strange light. "When I touched the crystals, I saw possibilities, visions, power beyond imagination." He looked at Eleanor. "You've kept this hidden for decades. Why?" "Because some things aren't meant to be possessed," she replied quietly. "Edward and I learned that lesson the hard way. The crystals show you what you most desire, Victor, but fulfilling those visions comes at a cost greater than anyone should pay." By morning, they had returned to the main house, Caldwell installed in a guest room under Rebecca's medical supervision. The mine collapse had been felt as far as Silver Creek, registered as a minor earthquake that fortunately caused no significant damage beyond the mountain itself. Justice Montgomery arrived shortly after dawn, concerned by reports of the tremors and the absence of the defendants from his court. In Eleanor's study, Thomas presented the family records, establishing his Thornfield lineage beyond question. "This conclusively refutes the allegations in Mr. Caldwell's petition," Montgomery noted, examining the documents. "Though I understand Mr. Caldwell has withdrawn his complaint regardless." "He has," Eleanor confirmed. "We've reached an understanding." What she didn't explain was the conversation that had occurred in the early hours of the morning. Caldwell, shaken by his experience in the crystal chamber and his brush with death, agreeing to abandon his pursuit of Silvercrest in exchange for Eleanor's silence about certain questionable business practices the visions had compelled him to confess. After the justice departed, satisfied that the matter was resolved, Thomas found Eleanor in her private study, gazing out at the mountains where sunrise illuminated the collapsed mine entrance, now just another feature in the rugged landscape. "What happens now?" he asked, joining her at the window. "Life continues," she replied simply. "The cattle drive will return in 4 days. The spring planting needs attention. Silvercrest endures, as it has for decades." "And what about us?" Thomas inquired. "Your elaborate scheme to bring me here as a mail-order husband seems unnecessary now that my family connection is established." Eleanor smiled, the morning light softening the lines of her remarkable face. "Perhaps the scheme served its purpose regardless. You came seeking one future and discovered another, your true heritage, your rightful place." She turned to face him fully. "The marriage proposal was a practical solution to a legal problem. But your place at Silvercrest doesn't depend on it. You're a Thornfield. This land is part of your birthright, whether you choose to claim it or not." Thomas considered this, realizing how profoundly his perspective had shifted in the brief days since his arrival. The anger and sense of betrayal that had initially consumed him had given way to understanding, then to a growing connection to both Eleanor and Silvercrest itself. "And if I choose to stay," he asked, "to learn ranching, to help preserve what you and Edward built?" "Then Silvercrest gains a worthy heir," she replied warmly, "and I gain something I've lacked for too long: family." As if to punctuate her words, Rebecca appeared at the doorway. "Mrs. Thornfield, the hands are returning from the cattle drive early. Jackson spotted them crossing the north pasture." Eleanor's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Early? That's unusual." They moved to the front porch, where Thomas was startled to see not just the returning ranch hands, but what appeared to be the entire population of Silver Creek approaching Silvercrest, wagons, riders, and people on foot streaming toward the ranch in a festive procession. "What's happening?" he asked, confused. Eleanor's expression shifted from surprise to something like amused resignation. "It appears news travels fast. The earthquake, Caldwell's sudden change of heart, your confirmation as my relative. The territory loves nothing more than a dramatic story with a satisfying conclusion." Sheriff Hayes rode ahead of the procession, reining in before the porch. "Mrs. Thornfield," he called, tipping his hat. "The folks of Silver Creek thought it appropriate to welcome your great-nephew properly to the territory, now that all misunderstandings have been cleared up." A celebration quickly spread across the ranch yard, tables appearing from wagons, food and drink shared, music striking up as the community embraced the resolution of what had become the territory's most compelling drama in years. As Thomas stood beside Eleanor, accepting congratulations and welcoming words from people who days earlier had viewed him with suspicion, he felt a profound sense of homecoming. Philadelphia and its failures seemed a distant memory, replaced by the expansive possibility of this new life. "You planned all of this somehow, didn't you?" he murmured to Eleanor as they watched the festivities. "From the moment you discovered my existence, you set events in motion that would bring me here, test me, and ultimately reveal my true heritage." Her eyes twinkled with mischief and wisdom. "I may have established certain conditions, Thomas, but you fulfilled them through your own choices. You could have left at any point, returned east, accepted Caldwell's inevitable job offer, abandoned what must have seemed like madness. Instead, you chose to stay, to fight, to risk yourself for this land and its legacy." She gestured toward the celebrating community, then to the vast Silvercrest holdings beyond. "This is your true inheritance, not just property, but purpose. A chance to continue what Edward began, what I've sustained, and what you will one day guide into the future." As the sun climbed higher over Montana territory, Thomas Blackwood, now proudly acknowledging his Thornfield heritage, found himself embracing a destiny he could never have imagined when he first stepped off the train at Silver Creek. The mail-order husband scheme had been merely a device to bring him west. The elderly bride disguised a test of character rather than a genuine proposal. The real offer had been infinitely more valuable: a home, a purpose, a legacy worth protecting, and a remarkable great-aunt whose unconventional methods had led him precisely where he belonged. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.